after 4 comes 5. Yeah. Welcome everybody to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mark Koplovich. I put the extra L-E in there. Koplovich. He specifically said there's no E, and I pronounced the E. You're with the La Follette School of Public Affairs and with the Department of Political Science.
Yes.
You're going to talk with us about inflation, the global economy, and the consequences of the midterm elections. I now get to ask you the 5 questions that we ask everybody. You can answer in any way that you would like. Doesn't have to be true, just has to be believable. Mark, where were you born?
Montreal, Canada.
Look at that. And what province is Montreal in?
Quebec.
Quebec. Oh, thank you. And where'd you go to what we consider to be high school?
Pottsgrove High School in Pottstown, Pennsylvania.
What brought you from Montreal to Pennsylvania?
We were Anglophone expats when the language politics started in the late 1970s.
Je me souviens.
Yeah.
And then where'd you go for undergrad and what did you study?
I studied political science at Yale University.
And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees and what did you study?
I got my master's and my PhD in political science at Harvard.
And then you spent some time at Princeton.
Yes. So I spent a long time in the Ivy League before I ended up in the Big Ten.
Way to go. It's great to have you at a public land grant research and extension university. When did you come to UW-Madison?
I've been here since 2006.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to this. Would you please join me in welcoming Mark Koplovich to Wednesday Night at the Lab?
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for coming out. Nice to see people here and people on Zoom as well. So Tom gave me the unfair assignment of talking about all of these different things in 55 minutes. So I'm going to kind of do my best of talking about inflation and the global economy and the election consequences of the midterms. Let's see here. There we go. So I'll kind of do it in 3 parts. So I'm going to talk about what's going on with inflation, both in the United States and globally. Talk a little bit about why we've obsessed about inflation amidst what has actually been an incredible recovery. And I will do that in the context of talking about some of the research that I'm doing actually on media usage and public opinion on inflation in the economy. Then I'll talk about the global economy, kind of where things are. The big thing that I'm going to focus on is the impact of the war in Ukraine and the economic sanctions and the spillover effects those are having on the economy. And then, in as much as I have time, I'm a scholar of international relations and the politics of the global economy, but I'll put on my hat as an American political scientist and tell you a little bit about what happened with the election and some of the consequences of that. So let me start with the scary chart, right? Most people in this room remember the really scary part of this chart. This is inflation, the 1970s. One of my first memories is sitting in the gas lines in the second oil shock with my father on the alternate days when you could fill up your car in our giant Delta 88 that got 6 miles to the gallon. So that kind of dates me. But you see here, inflation is very high. It's the highest it's been in 40 years. It is not the 1970s. Right? And you can kind of look in 2 metrics of inflation, the overall measure, the consumer price index, and then what is called core inflation. Food and energy tend to be more volatile, and if you want kind of underlying trends of inflation, we tend to pull out core. So core overall inflation is about 8% right now. Core is about 6%. That is very high because we have just lived through a couple of decades of extremely low inflation. It is not the close to 15%, and the double-digit inflation we had for almost a decade in the 1970s. And in the U.S., at least, we kind of hit peak inflation now, it looks like several months ago, all right, sometime over the course of the summer. So when we think about inflation, These are the annual rates, the change over the last 12 months. But if you want to think about kind of where things are going, we look in shorter term, in particular at the kind of the 3-month trend of inflation. And you'll see on both overall inflation and core inflation, the trend is downward, right? We're not back to 2% inflation target or kind of pre-COVID inflation. But as I'll show you in a few minutes with Europe, right, inflation is still rising in Europe, and in the US it looks like we're kind of past peak inflation. The other way you can see that on the bottom chart there is gas prices, right? So gas prices were up above $5 a gallon, or close to $5 a gallon. They're back in the threes. And just in nominal terms, not even controlling for inflation, that actually means gas is now below where it was in 2012 to 2013. Right? So just as a forecast is what I'll sort of talk about in terms of mild media hysteria about inflation. You don't remember the dominant coverage of $3.60 gasoline as sort of the central issue of American politics in 2012, because it didn't actually happen. So in the United States, right, there's a huge debate, policymakers, academics, in media and the punditry about what caused the inflation, right? And there are sort of two factors. There's supply side factors and there's just demand side factors. So on the supply side, you can think about all of the supply chain problems stemming from COVID. More recently, the price shocks from the war in Ukraine, so rising food prices, oil prices, et cetera. On the demand side, you can think about economic stimulus, right? The American Rescue Plan, et cetera. And there's a lot of debate, right, about which of those has driven American inflation. Most of the debate in the United States has been fairly parochial, and on the side of the American Rescue Plan and U.S. economic policy is what's driving inflation. There's been several studies. This is one of them from Adam Shapiro at the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank that's tried to kind of tease out the relative amount of these. And what these studies show is that about 2/3 of it is the supply chain side, the supply side of it, and 1/3 is the demand side of it. So to put that in concrete numbers, if you compare U.S. inflation, annualized inflation in the G7, the kind of advanced industrialized countries right now, the U.S. is kind of in the middle, right? Inflation is high around the world. The core inflation is about 2 to 3% higher in the United States, right? And so the way to think about that is there is a demand side component. We did a lot more economic stimulus than other countries did. That has caused about 2 to 3% higher inflation in the United States. More driven on the supply side, especially more recently food and energy prices in Europe. But as I'll also show you, we've had a much stronger economic recovery, right, than our counterparts. So inflation's high around the world. You can go beyond the advanced, developed, rich economies, and you can look across the world and basically see the American Rescue Plan did not cause all of this. Inflation is high around the world and is driven very much by the sort of pandemic and war supply side shock of things. So it's high in Africa, it's high in Asia and Pacific, it's high in Europe, it's high in the Middle East, it's also high in the United States. But you also see some differentials in terms of who is most vulnerable in terms of the shock. So that's kind of inflation around the world. And as I said, inflation is high. But the other thing that has happened in the U.S. economy is when you start to look at employment and jobs and the economic recovery, we have been living through an unprecedentedly rapid and successful economic recovery. So this is my favorite chart to illustrate that. What you're looking at here is how high did unemployment go, or basically the drop in employment on the y-axis here, and then how many months from the peak of employment before a recession or crisis started did it take to recover? Right. This is the global financial crisis in 2008 that ended up being a whole lost decade or Great Recession, where it took us over 10 years to go from where we were in 2007 in terms of employment. We had a 7% increase in unemployment, and it took us over a decade to get back. Right. We had a much sharper drop in employment during the pandemic, but in less than 3 years, we've gotten back to full employment, right? So we went from 3.5% unemployment around February of 2020 up to 14.7%, and we're back in the mid-threes again, right? And that is unprecedentedly rapid. You see, if you remember the 2001, et cetera, recession, you see that in there as well. So historically, if you go back in US history, this is an unprecedentedly rapid recovery. One way to see that is to see on the top chart here, this is unemployment if we go all the way back to World War II. Right? So you see the big spikes. You see the 1970s oil shocks recession. You see the recession we had in the mid-'80s, and you see the Great Recession. Right? So we had this giant spike in unemployment, but it was a very short-term spike because of the pandemic, and we've come back. Right? A fair amount of that is actually due to the economic stimulus in terms of checks that people receive, the Paycheck Protection Program, forgivable loans to businesses so people didn't have to be laid off. So, a lot of the government policies that were put in place starting in December 2020 actually had a major effect in terms of the recovery. The other way to sort of see that the economy is doing very, very well is we've had 22 straight months of job growth, right, which is also something that is all but unprecedented in the United States economy over the last many decades. So there's been a lot of talk, and you've probably read a lot about, are we in a recession? Right? This is not what the economy looks like when we're in a recession, that we have very strong job market growth and 3.5% unemployment. Right? So what we don't have right now is the stagflation that some of you remember from the 1970s, where unemployment was high and inflation was high, and that lasted for the better part of a decade. Right? The other thing to think about is inflation-adjusted income. Right, so this is another chart that I think is helpful for getting our heads around the state of the economy. This is real disposable income per capita, so per person in the United States, so kind of average real disposable income. So this is controlling for inflation, right? And you see when the crisis hit, this is kind of where we were in the winter of 2020. It's basically where we are now, right? So the average American is actually not seeing a decline controlling for inflation in their income, and there was a big spike in the middle. This is a lot of the stimulus that people received in terms of spikes to our income because of checks. So again, there's a lot of talk about people suffering from inflation, and it's true. Right, inflation is eroding real wages, especially people at the lower end of the income scale suffer more from rising food prices and inflation in general. But on average, Americans are no poorer now than they were, right, than they were before the COVID crisis. If you look at Europe, things are less rosy in the sense that inflation continues to rise. Right, so the British numbers just came out today, and they're over 11%. This is inflation in the Eurozone. Right, so in the European Monetary Union, it continues to go up. Europe is much more exposed to oil and gas and the food price shock from the Russia-Ukraine war. So we're in a position in the U.S. where inflation is starting to come down. It's still high, but coming down. In Europe, it continues to go up. And you also see the kind of real economic recovery. Europe is now entering its second economic crisis in a row where it looks like they're not going to have a complete recovery. Right, so this is all, again, by way of saying inflation is high in the United States, but the relative performance of the U.S. economy is strong, and we've had a very strong economic recovery since January 2020. Right. Now, the global picture is less rosy. Right, so these are some numbers from the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook. There are a very large number of countries in October 2022 compared to the beginning of the year that are experiencing recessions. Right, and we are continually adjusting our growth and inflation forecasts to be more pessimistic. And this is, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, this is a lot of the spillover from the war in Ukraine and rising oil prices and commodity prices. So it's not to say that everything is rosy, but the picture in the United States is actually much more positive than it is in other parts of the world. Right. Now, that story I told you is, if I had to guess, probably not what you have heard and what you have read and what most people you've talked to have thought about the state of the U.S. economy, right? Because you haven't heard about it in the news, right? So this is a Nexus search of all news articles from January 2021 until now, with inflation, recession, unemployment or recovery in the title, and Biden and Federal Reserve in the article. Right? So this bar is since January of 2021. This is just since August. right? So this is how the media has covered the U.S. economy, which I actually had to stop that bar at 10,000 because the search only goes up to 10,000. So there are actually more than 10,000 in there. But orders of magnitude more coverage of inflation and recession. Basically, since August, you've heard nothing about the fact that unemployment is back to where it was before the pandemic, and literally nothing, essentially, on the economic recovery relative to inflation, gas prices. That's sort of what's been driving the debate, which I think is why when you see polls, most people think the economy is doing absolutely terrible. So this is a Morning Consult poll that came out a week and a half before the election, where the majority of people polled in this kind of nationally representative sample gave the U.S. economy a D or an F. Right. So this is an economy with 22 straight months of job growth and 3.5% unemployment, where people's income is no lower than it was in 2020, and everybody's saying that this is a D or an F economy. Right. So this intrigued me and my colleague. This is Mike Wagner from the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. We got interested a few months ago in this question of the degree to which media coverage and media use affects public opinion about inflation and the state of the economy. So you're getting to see some just hot off the presses survey results of some of our research in progress. So we're interested in how and to what extent the amount and type of media individuals consume and the people they discuss politics with shapes public opinion on the economy. And we're also interested, I'm going to show you a little experimental analysis that we did. If you give people information about inflation in the US relative to inflation elsewhere and the degree to which global factors are driving inflation as opposed to domestic factors, does it alter their views about inflation in the economy? So we just got this data back. We fielded a survey through YouGov back in mid-August. And so it's a nationally representative sample of 2,000 US citizens. We try and get a sample that is representative on a bunch of different dimensions. So there's some nitty-gritty in here, but it's gender, age, race, kind of balancing on census data, who people voted for in the election, all education levels, income, all of those things. And in that survey, we're asking people their views about the economy. We're asking people what media they use, and we're also kind of embedding these experimental treatments. And what we're trying to focus on the outcome is the degree to which people are concerned about inflation. All right, so we ask a bunch of different questions. These are all on 1 to 5. They're what are known as Likert scales. So how concerned are you about X? 1, I'm not at all concerned. 5, I'm very concerned, and it's kind of a 5-point scale. How concerned are you about inflation? How big a national problem is it? How big a problem do you think each of the 2 major parties thinks it is? How big of a problem do you think the media thinks it is? And how big of a problem is it for you and your family? So that's kind of, that's our outcome variable or the dependent variable that we're measuring. And then the focus on the explanatory variables is how interested are you in political news, and what media do you consume? Right? So you see the questions here that people are answering of basically on a 1 to 4 scale, how closely do you follow politics? And then on a wide range of media sources, how often do you use them on a 1 to 5 scale? Right? So we ask people about local newspapers, the kind of national papers of record, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the major cable news networks, right? Conservative talk radio, social media, et cetera. So kind of a wide range of media. And then we also ask people, who do you talk to about politics? Okay, so we ask people to open-ended questions of, tell us 3 people with whom you talk about politics. How often do you talk to them? Who are they? And what is their political partisanship and also their kind of income and education? And so, we're not there yet in terms of the research, but we're going to unpack and explore, right, these combinations of who do you talk to, right? Do they share your views? Are they different than you? What media do you consume? What media do they consume? And then we have a lot of variables in here that you would want to try and think about other factors that might shape people's opinions about inflation in the economy, right? So your party identification, who did you vote for in 2020, your income, your occupation. This is to measure how sensitive you might be about gas prices, right? How far do you commute? We have state of residence, we have your personal financial situation, you have what sector of the economy are you employed in. So, this is hot off the presses and we haven't analyzed all the data, but that's what the sample looks like. And I'm just going to show you a few of some of the basic results. So this is just a descriptive table of how concerned are you about inflation based on how closely you follow politics. All right? So the more closely people follow politics, the more concerned they are about inflation. Significantly more than people who don't follow politics closely. This is how concerned are you about inflation versus how often do you talk to people about politics. All right? And so the more you talk to people about politics, the more frequent those engagements are, the more concerned you are about inflation. Right? And then this is just a very simple first cut crosstab table where we coded some of the media as conservative, right? And sort of we have in here Fox News, National Conservative Talk Radio, Breitbart, One America, Daily Caller, and in the last week have you used those fairly often or often, and you're a 1. And you see, what in this regression analysis actually turns out to be a significant difference. If you are consuming those media, you are more likely to be concerned about inflation. Right? So those are just kind of simple crosstab tables. If any of you are interested in or familiar with statistical regression analysis, this is the actual statistical analysis on that first question of how concerned are you about inflation. Okay, and we have in there recent media use, right? And then who do you talk to? So the frequency of talks is significant across all the models, right? To different degrees, but that's the result I just showed you of the more you talk to people about politics, the more concerned you are about inflation. What's interesting in these first results is you actually get very different views, right? Depending on what media you consume. Right, so the general takeaway here is if people who are consuming more conservative media are more concerned about inflation, people who are consuming more mainstream papers of record, liberal, depending on how you classify MSNBC, so MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, you are less concerned about inflation. And so far, there seems to be nothing on the social media side in terms of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, right? But so some interesting results here in the sense of it might be that kind of the media ecosystem you live in and the media you consume is kind of framing the message and how you think about inflation. Now, the other thing we did, which is the experimental part, is we gave half of the sample this global context treatment before they answered the questions, right? So what you have in here is basically some information of what I was just talking to you about a few minutes ago, which is how concerned are you? I'll ask you how concerned you are about inflation after I tell you that inflation is a global problem. It's high not just in the US but elsewhere. And the inflation that we're now seeing in mid-2022 is actually driven primarily by what's going on with the war in Russia and Ukraine. So some people got that, other people didn't, right? So far, it turns out that treatment alone doesn't seem to affect people's responses, but if you look in subsamples by Republicans and Democrats, you get a really interesting result, right? So if you got that global context treatment, here's all this information about inflation and the degree to which it's driven by the global economy, and you were a Democrat, you become significantly more concerned about inflation. If you are a Republican, you become significantly less concerned about inflation, right? So there are a number of possible explanations of this, but one is sort of simply to think about, if I'm a Democrat, I might think that Biden and the Democrats have inflation under control. And then if you give me this information that it's a really serious global problem and it's happening everywhere, maybe I'm less confident that is the case. And maybe things work in the other direction, that I might be primed as a Republican to think that Biden doesn't have inflation under control, right? And if you tell me about the global context as well, we seem to do relatively well. So we're sort of still unpacking that and exploring that. But I thought it might be interesting for you just to see some of the research behind, kind of the views that I was expressing about the state of inflation in the economy. So let me shift gears a little bit then and think not just about inflation, but the kind of broader situation of the global economy. The war in Ukraine basically has extended out, again, in a more pessimistic way, views about what growth and inflation are going to look like at the global level. So these are a couple more charts from that same International Monetary Fund report from July. And the basic takeaway is, the degree to which we thought the economy was slowing down has gotten worse, and we think the economy is going to slow down even more. And the degree to which we thought inflation was going to last, it's going to be higher and more persistent for longer because of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. So that's sort of gloomy, right? We're more pessimistic about things since the war. If you want something a little more positive, the really bad case scenario that I think everybody feared in February and March and April seems not to be playing out, which is we're going to have a massive oil shocks type of scenario where oil prices are going to go up by 50%, right? And food prices are going to go up by 50%, and they're going to stay that way. So this is natural gas, crude oil, and wheat, right? The global price of each of these. This is an index chart. They're all different numbers, so you set this to 100%. And I set it for 100% to February 24th, which was the day of the Russian invasion, right? So you see the giant spike in all of these, but you also see basically that on all of these commodities, we are basically back to pre-war levels, right? So what that means is it's probably not a permanent step change that's going to be a multi-year increase of 30, 40, 50% of these commodities. So there has been an inflation shock to the economy, but it's one that probably has more of a half-life. And the kind of doom and gloom scenarios that this is going to bring down the global economy probably are not as severe. And the reason for that is Russia is actually quite small in the global economy. Right, so I like this chart. I'm an international relations professor in political science, but I study the global economy side of things. So this is the chart I put up when my security studies, scholars think about, well, the two great powers in the world are the U.S. and Russia. Right, China's kind of third because of nuclear weapons. This is trade and finance in the global economy. Right, so on this side here, you're looking at world exports. And the circles are countries, and then the kind of, lines are what's connecting them. So this is kind of the entire global trading system. And this is global financial flows. So bank lending, bond financing, stock market investment, currency trading, those sorts of things. And so you see here, right, in trade, it's really a tripolar world. It's the US and China are roughly the same size in the global economy in terms of trade. And then this is the European Union, or the European Union plus Great Britain, because they're not in the European Union anymore, right? And so you see Russia is in there. You can see Russia, but they're kind of small relative to those three, right? And then this is in finance, right? And this is very much where if you think about, is China catching up to the US, or how big is Russia, right? You realize how dominant the United States is in global finance. Right? The dollar is still about 65% of global currency reserves, and we and the EU basically dominate global finance. You really have to squint to see Russia here. You also kind of have to squint to see China. Right? They're not that big. Right? So it's not that the war in Ukraine and sort of tensions with Russia aren't going to affect the global economy, but it's very different than if we were talking about China invading Taiwan. Right, and what would be the global economic spillovers of that type of shock to the system, right? And that's where we think about what we call asymmetric interdependence, right? So countries are tied together and linked through the global economy. They're interdependent with each other, but there's an unevenness or an asymmetry in the interdependence, right? And the short way to think about that is Russia is much more dependent on the rest of the world than the rest of the world is on Russia. Right? So one of the things you have seen is you have this short-term spike in oil and gas prices. A lot of discussion, if any of you have followed the debate in Germany or in Europe more generally, about can we wean ourselves off of Russian gas, and we're heavily dependent on them. In a very short amount of time, Russia has gone from being the dominant provider of natural gas to the European Union countries to almost not at all. Right? And there was a lot of talk over the summer of the EU, Germany in particular, is going to go into winter basically not having any natural gas reserves, and what are they going to do? And there's going to be huge shortages and price spikes. The latest data as of October actually is basically that's not the case. Right? The prices are still high in Europe, but there isn't going to be a supply shortage. And the reason why is there's been an almost one-to-one switch in Russian gas exports to liquefied natural gas imports from places like the United States. Right? So that's more expensive. It takes time to shift, but it's happened very quickly. And that kind of illustrates the asymmetry of the interdependence. And I'll show you some more about the Russian economy in a second. But basically, Russia is getting shut off because of sanctions from the global economy that is hurting them vastly more than it is hurting the United States or the European Union countries right now. The countries that are being hit the hardest are developing countries. Right? So there are a lot of countries that are dependent on Russia and Ukraine for food. Right? And so the food prices for countries in West and Sub-Saharan Africa have gone through the roof. You've probably seen in the news there's a tentative deal to allow Ukraine to ship out grain through the Black Sea. Russia tried to blockade that and break the deal, and Turkey pushed back and said no. But there's a lot of concerns about food security and food prices, and so developing countries are going to be hit much more, right, than the rich countries, than the EU or the US or Japan. So that's sort of, that's what's going on in terms of the spillovers. Let me just talk about the Russian economy for a few minutes. Basically, the Russian economy is imploding. Right? One of the other things you probably have heard in the news is that the sanctions aren't working and Russia is evading them. That's true a little bit. That's mostly not true. But the Russian economy is in free fall. So this is, not surprisingly, the Bank of Finland is one of the best data sources for data on the Russian economy. Right? And so this is another one of these index charts. So this is Russia's GDP. Let's call it 100% in 2013. Let's see kind of how much it has grown. You see it had grown quite a bit in 19, 20, 21. You see where the projection was, and you see where it is now. So 4% contraction this quarter was the data that just came out. So basically, the Russian economy is collapsing. There's a lot of data out there. If you look at Russian manufacturing, basically any type of manufacturing that could potentially be repurposed into producing weapons. Heavy manufacturing, heavy industry in Russia has collapsed somewhere between 10 and 50%, right, over the last 6 months now. So huge collapse of the Russian economy, largely because of the sanctions that the U.S. and the European Union and the advanced industrialized countries have put in place. So there's been a kind of unprecedented set of sanctions to cut off trade and financial flows to Russia. And the question then for Russia is, can you find alternative places to sell what you have to sell, which is primarily oil and gas? And can you find alternative places to import things, in particular importing things that are going to go into manufacturing so you can keep fighting the war, right? And so far the answer is kind of, but not really. Right? So this is Russia's oil shipments. And what has happened is China, India, and Turkey are still buying oil from Russia. But what they're buying is not enough to offset the decline in exports to the rest of the world. And they're doing it at cut rate prices. Right? So oil is denominated in dollars in the global economy. And we have different benchmarks based on the quality of oil. So the benchmark rate is Brent crude, which is Norwegian oil, right? And then you have Urals crude, you have West Texas crude, Urals is the Russian oil. And you see the smaller chart there, before the war, there was a slight premium. Brent crude was slightly higher in price than Urals was. Urals oil now is 20 to 30% lower. So China, Turkey, and India are still buying oil, but what they're doing is buying a lot of very cheap oil from Russia, and they're not buying enough to offset the decline of exports to other parts of the world. Right? So it's not a complete implosion of Russia oil imports, but it's a huge hit. The other part is to think about, on the import side, can we import stuff from other countries to replace all of the trade that is no longer happening? Right? The sanctions have been incredibly effective in the way that they were with Iran, that basically EU countries, the US, Canada, Japan, Switzerland, right, the West broadly, has cut off and banned all trade with China, right, and financial flows to China. And so you see this massive decline after the invasion, right, a basically 50% decline in trade. And that's gone up a little bit. Again, there is trade with China, there's trade with India, there's trade with Turkey, but it hasn't nearly offset things. It's kind of back to early 2020 levels. And in terms of what China is still selling and what Turkey and India are still selling to Russia, what we know from the data is it doesn't seem to be the sorts of things that might be repurposed into military applications. Right? You know, so Russia, there are a lot of stories of Russia running out of parts, right, to keep the railways and airlines running. A lot of abandoned military equipment because there are shortages of ball bearings and other replacement parts. And so it's going to get harder and harder for Russia to keep fighting the war as time goes on because of the sanctions. Right? So there's a lot of, while the sanctions aren't working, Russia's able to evade some of them, and that is true. Sanctions aren't really a substitute for military force, and what they were designed to do is, over a period of years, degrade Russia's ability to fight the war, right, and to keep its economy running. And it's actually quite striking in 6 months how effective that has been. The other thing that's quite striking, just before I switch gears and talk a little bit about the election, is the war has gone extraordinarily well for the Ukrainians. Right? I don't think many of us at all in February thought we would be looking at this map, right, in terms of the amount of territory that Ukraine has actually taken back. Right? And the big news this week was the liberation of Kherson. You probably saw not only Ukrainian flags, but the raising of EU flags in front of the town hall in Kherson. So that is partly that the Russian military has turned out not to be as effective as we thought it would be, but partly that the sanctions are actually having an effect, right, in terms of Russia's ability to prosecute the war. Also partly that the Ukrainians have fought brilliantly, and there was a big Western investment, the Canadians and other, actually, in training Ukrainian soldiers over the last decade, and it's turning out that the Ukrainian military operationally has actually fought a brilliant war. So extraordinary progress and success. The other part of it, though, is the economic and military investment, right? So this map would not be the map that we would be looking at if NATO and the West broadly had not basically gone all in on financing the war. What's interesting about it, actually, is it is NATO. So this is data from the University of Kiel in Germany. This is overall military aid, the absolute number. And then this is an interesting one because it's as percent of GDP. Right? So what you see over here is actually really interesting. It is the other former Soviet bloc states that are now part of NATO and the European Union who have really gone all in and are punching above their weight. So it's the Baltics, it's the Czechs, it's the Poles in particular. And it's the US and the UK. Right? So I gave a talk earlier today where I said, for all the UK left the EU and the Brexit disaster and debacle, the British, right, have been very strong, staunch Europeans and Atlanticists when it's come to the Ukraine war. But you see the US and the UK, and you see the Baltics. Right? Who are the countries you don't see here? Right? France is not on the list at all. Right? Emmanuel Macron, there's been a lot of flowery rhetoric about the West and about support for Ukraine. But in a money where your mouth is kind of way, France has not stepped up. Germany has stepped up more, and there was a lot of discussion in March and April of what was known as the Zeitenwende, or kind of the world turn, that we're in a new world and we're going to kind of decouple from Russia. and focus more on, NATO and military investment. That hasn't fully happened yet, and so it is kind of interesting that what you have here is the US and the UK, the kind of old Anglo alliance, plus the new members of the EU and NATO from the former Soviet bloc that are really leading the way, and sort of a glaring absence of the Franco-German engine, which is what usually drives European cooperation. So that's sort of where we are in terms of the economy and the war and some of the spillovers from the war, how they're going to affect things like growth and recovery and inflation. I think, again, you've heard a lot about the sanctions not working. I think over the next 6 months to a year or so, we're going to see just exactly how much damage they've inflicted. Russia really has been decoupled from the global economy, and that's where that asymmetric interdependence kicks in. The world basically, even on oil and gas now, doesn't really need Russia as much as it did 6 months ago. And the ability of a Ukraine backed by NATO and backed by the EU and plugged into the West economically to fight the war versus Russia, the balance of power really seems to have shifted now over the last 6 months. All right, so take off my international relations hat and I'll put on a little of my, educated consumer of American politics who has talked to my political science colleagues sort of what has gone on with the elections and some of the consequences of that. So, what happened? It was a historically good midterm for an incumbent president and party, right? That's not the narrative a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago that everybody thought we were going to be talking about. Huge turnout, driven by three big factors, and I'll show you some data on that in terms of abortion, the economy, and democracy concerns. And then I'll come back to some of the economic stuff and related to what I was talking about inflation and the media coverage of that versus the actual state of the economy. I am a little less surprised about that than I think some other people are because of how good the economy on the employment side actually was. And talk about some of the consequences. So kind of here's where we are. We know the Democrats now have controlled the Senate. There's the one seat left to go. We actually know as of tonight that the Republicans have the House. So it's 218 to 210 is the latest number, and there's still a few seats left. It is going to be quite a theatrical exposition to see the speaker vote and to see if Kevin McCarthy wins, to see him try and govern a one-seat majority in the House, but the Republicans are going to control the House. So, losing the House is not good for Biden and the Democrats, but that is a historically strong result. So this is data back to World War II, where the short answer is the best you can hope for as a president is that you don't get totally shellacked in the midterms, right? Often you lose 40, 50, 30, 40, 50 seats in the House. This is going to turn out to be, I believe, single digits, right? So it's very small, and they held the Senate, right? So that, in terms of not just where people thought things were going to be 2 weeks ago, right, when the story was the red wave, but also just in broad historical terms, right? It's we haven't seen an election this successful for an incumbent president and his party in a very, very long time. Now, that was driven by very strong turnout, right? So turnout in 2022 was very high. We've actually gotten back kind of to where we were in the 1960s and early 1970s instead of turnout after decades of lower turnout. Turnout is always lower in the midterms than it is in presidential years, but it was very high, and as you know, it was incredibly high in Wisconsin. Right? 63% turnout for a midterm election is enormous turnout in Wisconsin, certainly compared to other parts of the country as well, and that was driven by young voters, right? So this is 18 to 29 voters, not as high as in 2018, but still much higher than 2010, 2014. And you sort of see the age breakdown over here, right? A lot of discussion in my corner of the world because I'm 47 years old of like Gen X is getting erased again and thrown in with the younger boomers, right, into one demographic here. But you sort of see the age breakdown there. And it turned out, right, the election wasn't just about inflation and the economy. Right? So the other narrative 2 weeks ago seemed to be that it was a mistake for the Democrats to focus on abortion, right? And that the election was a referendum on the economy and everybody was worried about inflation. People were worried about inflation. So this is, you take exit polls with grains of salt, but this is the largest, most reputable exit poll that's out there of inflation, abortion, gun policy, crime, and immigration were the 5 big issues, and really inflation and abortion were the 2 biggest issues. But you see big partisan differences there, right? So you don't actually look at that data and say necessarily that it was a mistake for the Democrats to emphasize abortion, because that's actually what Democratic voters said was the most important issue. And those numbers are in the middle if you look at independents, right? So there were concerns about abortion and about inflation amongst independent voters. So it wasn't just about inflation. And as I was speaking about earlier, and I'll talk about again in a minute or so, inflation is not the entire economy. Right? So it turns out people were concerned about inflation and upset about inflation and gas prices, but they weren't angry about the economy as they were in, say, 2010, when unemployment was actually 9+%. Right? So why didn't inflation in the economy sink the Democrats? And as someone who studies political economy, that for me is kind of the question. And one is unquestionably that turnout, right, especially for women and younger voters, offset the red wave. And that very much was concerns about abortion. I think on the employment side, this is another way to look at it of unemployment by metropolitan areas. You can look at Pennsylvania and you can see the very low unemployment in Pennsylvania where the Democrats actually flipped the Senate seat. You can think about Wisconsin where Evers got reelected. Inflation was high, but when unemployment is very low single digits, right, it's not necessarily the thing that's going to motivate people. I look at the pump. I see that all the time, right? I don't like paying for high gas, but unemployment was 15% and I was out of work a year and a half ago, and I'm working now and my wages are higher than they've been in a very long time, right? And so how people process and think about the economy is multidimensional. And again, in a time when we've had basically 2 straight years of very strong job growth, there's probably a limit, it turns out, into how much inflation, right, is really moving people to the polls, right? And you saw that chart again, controlling for inflation, right? People's real income actually hasn't gone down. Right? So just for comparison, this is what the world looked like in 2010, right, when the Democrats did get shellacked. Right? So this is inflation-adjusted consumption in the economy. Right? So you actually see we've never recovered from the global financial crisis and Great Recession. Right? There's some good studies out there that the average household probably lost lifetime $70,000 or so that we're never really going to get back. It's not actually like you and I had $70,000, but if you average out the hit to the U.S. economy by the number of households, we still have not recovered. We had a basically complete recovery in terms of people's inflation-adjusted consumption in the economy, and that was the unemployment rate in 2010. Right? So this is where Obama was fighting the midterm in 2010. Right? So there was basically the bottom of the Great Recession and nearly 10% unemployment. Right? So that is a very different state of the economy, and it's sort of thinking not just about the prices, but the real economy. Inflation was really, really low there, but inflation was really, really low because the economy was a mess and lots of people were out of work. Right? And so, very different take from my perspective of it turned out that everything everybody was talking about and the media was reporting about was gas prices and inflation, and nobody was talking about the recovery, but I think a lot of voters felt the recovery. Right? And sort of, looked at their pocketbook and sort of looked at the state of the world and said, I don't like high gas prices, but I'm actually doing fairly well off, and the economy seems to be doing kind of okay. Right? So you didn't have a massive backlash. Now, just to finish up in terms of thinking about consequences, so one of the consequences is probably going to be policy gridlock. Right? So we have divided government in Congress now. Right? So it's going to be much harder. Biden accomplished an extraordinary amount legislatively with very, very thin majorities over the last 2 years. He doesn't have a majority in one of the houses, though, and he's not controlling the agenda, right? So you're probably going to see very little in the way of new substantive legislation coming out of Congress, what you're going to see is a focus on judges. Right, so Biden already has appointed a record number of judges to the federal bench. And I think you're going to see, in the absence of the Senate seeing that legislation is going to be coming from the other side of the Capitol, and we should be spending our time debating bills, you're going to be seeing Senator Schumer stacking the docket with judicial appointments. Right? So that's kind of domestically what I think you're going to see. You know, the other thing is democracy had a pretty good election. Right? So the people who were explicit election deniers and sort of out there very much articulating stories about mass voter fraud were almost unanimously defeated, right? And so that's good for democracy. But at the same time, right, the authoritarian threat is still out there, right? So of the Republicans that were reelected, the vast majority of them, right, voted against certifying the election results in 2020. And, you know, it was hard to, ignore the news from last night, I'm sure, if you follow the news, right, that Trump has announced he's running again. And so, democracy had a good night. I don't think that means, like, the concerns that we have had about democracy in the United States over the last 2 to 6 years or however long your timeline is, I don't think they've gone away, right? At the global level, I think Putin hoped for a shellacking, right? And that was going to undermine the unified Western support and the U.S. commitment to Ukraine that we were talking about earlier. And that is obviously not going to happen now. In fact, Biden has already asked for, this month's bill to keep the Ukraine military financing going. So I think, U.S. policy, and you've heard this also from, several prominent Republicans as well, that, we're going to sort of keep at this, and we're going to keep standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. The other thing I think you're going to see, as presidents do when there's divided government and they can't get legislation through Congress, is they start to shift more to the things that they do control, which is foreign policy. So Biden was in Bali for the G20 summit. He actually met with Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, in person for the first time, and there are rumblings now of kind of de-escalating tensions, right? Both sides making statements about Taiwan, starting up talks about climate change cooperation again. Janet Yellen was meeting with her counterpart, the Chinese finance minister, talking about economic cooperation. So we'll see what actually comes of that substantively, but I think a little more engagement on diplomacy and engagement with China is probably going to happen. So there we go. Oh, we lost it, but it's coming back for my last slide. So just to kind of summarize, I almost hit my time target. Just to summarize what I said. So inflation is high, falling in the U.S. steadily for several months now, and so I hope maybe I convinced you a little bit with some of the data and some of what I showed you that we kind of overshot on inflation in terms of focusing on it as the only metric of what's going on in the economy and drawing conclusions about how negative, right, and how poor the performance of the U.S. economy was. If you look more broadly, it's been a really unprecedented recovery, especially on the employment and the income side. Right? The global economy doesn't look as good as the U.S. economy, especially for Europe and developing countries. And the Russia-Ukraine war has had a major impact and is going to over the next year. But again, it's not on the same order of if we were talking about a China-Taiwan conflict, right, or something that's really going to totally derail the global economy over the next year or two. And again, the midterm election. So for me, it was not entirely unexpected. I wasn't sure, but I'm less surprised that inflation didn't resonate quite as much and that you didn't have the red wave. I think if you had asked Biden and the Democrats in February or March, this is the result, will you take it or leave it, they would have taken it in a second. And I think in many ways, both in domestic and foreign policy now, if you had unified Republican control of Congress, I think it might be different, but probably more continuity on both domestic and foreign policy than change, at least through 2024. And no one wants to make any predictions about 2024 because nobody knows anything past this week or next week. on that. So, all right, I'll stop there, and thank you. So.
Questions? Any questions? All right, Mike. Let's see if we can get the microphone to work here. Yay.
Yeah, one of your early slides showed that Japan, as usual, seems to be having relatively little problem with inflation.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why that is, particularly since there's such a paucity of natural resources within Japan itself. Thanks.
I mean, Japan's had 30 years of low inflation at this point. So one is less oil dependence, right? So they still, in terms of alternative energy, nuclear and whatnot, Japan has been fighting demographics for several decades now, right? So the challenge for Japan is to actually generate inflation because you have a rapidly aging society with a shrinking population. And so even with an inflationary shock at the global level, that made inflation is 3% in Japan. It hasn't been 3% in 20 years, right? So it's gone from basically no inflation or deflation in Japan to modest inflation, right? So the net change for Japan is about 4%, which is not that much smaller than across here, from like 2% up to 8% is 6%, right? But Japan's had about a 4% increase in inflation, which relative to what they've had since the 1990s is actually quite a lot. Yeah. Yes.
Great talk. Your nexus analysis of the inflation in the media.
I'm not sure I'd quite call it analysis, but at least, counting.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I understand. But so we liberals think that the Fox News would drive that because it sounds bad.
Right.
But if the real story was that it wasn't that bad and the coverage was good, why didn't the CNNs and New York Timeses and et cetera drive that story?
Right. So I think I don't have the chart here, but there was actually a lot of variation in who covered inflation. And so as you said, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, Breitbart, et cetera, covered inflation a lot more as a share of overall news articles than New York Times or Washington Post or CNN. I think that's why you see, some of this I know it's hard to read, but some of this in the statistical results here maybe point this out. So there probably was much more of that, excess coverage was probably on the conservative media side. And I think that's what you see driving, people who are consuming conservative media are made more concerned about inflation. It actually goes in the other direction with the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? I actually wasn't expecting that. I thought also given what you've seen of the media coverage in CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, that also consumption of that would drive inflation, but it seems actually to make people less concerned. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that could be. It could be they cover inflation a lot, but they're doing it well with accurate data and explaining what's going on, and so maybe my concern is diminished, even though there's a lot of coverage of it. So again, we're just starting to play with this data of what we know, but I do think this overall chart here. Probably, if I had to guess, it's 2/3 of it is in the more conservative media, and 1/3 is in the more mainstream or liberal.
During the Trump period, the stock market recovery very fast in 2020, even though it went down maybe 35 points, ended up 2020 10 points to the good.
Yeah.
This year it was down 22 or 23 points. Now it's down maybe 15 points. This is S&P 500.
Yeah.
I saw almost nothing about this loss of paper wealth during the campaign, and yet that was a big deal from which we have not recovered.
Mm-hmm.
Why was the stock market a bigger deal when it was 3 or 4 years ago than it was in the last year?
I'm speculating, but So some of that is partisan. I mean, if you think about the coalitions of the parties and the incentive to sort of focus on the interest of Wall Street, maybe. But, most Americans don't own stocks, right? I think a lot of the concern about the stock market showed up as concern about inflation, right? Because if you think about who doesn't like inflation and who wants higher interest rates and maybe wants the Fed to tighten and is focused more on monetary policy, right? That tends to weight more towards, people who are concerned about capital gains, people who are concerned about the state of the stock market and finance and things like that. But I don't know. I think, the focus for the Biden administration was, right, making sure that we don't have a rerun of the very long, persistent unemployment that we had. I think Biden spent a long time as the vice president in the Obama administration kind of observing the world from 2012 to 2016 and how the economy wasn't great, and calculated, I'm going to overshoot. If anything, I'm going to overshoot in the other direction, and we're going to have modestly higher inflation, but we're going to fix the economy, right? And so some of that was messaging. Trump was talking about the stock market because, that was one of the metrics, like the trade surplus, that for Trump, I think, was, in his head and in the White House, this is a measure of success, right? I don't think many people in the Biden administration were focused on the stock market. They weren't going to be able to go to the electorate and say, look, we saved the S&P 500, right? They can go to the electorate and they can say, look, unemployment is back to where it was in 2020. Right, and so I think it was probably more a tactical focus of, a little bit strategic about the policies, but then tactical in how to sell the policies to your constituents. And for the Democrats, I don't think, saying the S&P 500 is doing better than it was 6 months ago was going to turn out a lot of voters.
I think that these unemployment statistics that you've been showing, those come from asking people. They poll some sample. So how reliable are those numbers?
The unemployment data? So they're not all from surveys. So there are surveys, right? Some of them are looking at payrolls as well, right? So pretty confident in the BLS data. They do a pretty good job. You could say there's some error in measurement around these. Most data points, there's some sort of confidence interval around them. But the error, if we measure the unemployment rate at 3.5%, the error bars around that are probably, it could be 3% or it might be 4.1%, right? We know it's not 14.7%. We know it's not 9%. So there's some uncertainty around it, but the decline is shocking given how quickly it spiked up and how quickly it came back down. So I'm quite confident that those numbers are in the ballpark of what the actual, the thing these numbers don't have is underemployment, partial employment, those sorts of things, right? So there are statistics on that, but I think that they're noisier and the data are more spotty when you want to get into is everybody full-time employed versus I'm working 20 hours a week. Right? There's a lot more variability and spottiness in those data.
Very nice, Mark. Yeah. Very nice. Any thoughts on the lack of sincere support by the Germans and the French for Ukraine? I talk to a lot of the people in Europe, and they just don't seem to appreciate the benefit that they've had from the nuclear umbrella that the U.S. has provided for all these 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
They dither around. They talk a lot. Plenty of excuses.
I think that, yeah.
Oh, I live here, but I'm from the Netherlands originally, so
okay.
I keep that.
I think the support is sincere in terms of the political support. It's sort of in terms of delivering on the finances and things like that. So, look, in Germany, there's a complicated relationship with the U.S. nuclear umbrella, right? Another way to look at this is the party and part of the government actually that has been most ardently supportive of Ukraine is the Green Party. So Annalena Baerbock is the foreign minister, Robert Habeck is the economy minister. This is the party that basically, came into German politics on the issue of getting U.S. missiles out of Germany in the 1980s, right? And they're the ones that are saying we actually need to spend more on the military and we need to provide more. And the roadblock has been much more Scholz and the Social Democrats, right? And look, the Social Democrats have a tortured relationship with Russia, and Gerhard Schroeder has not clothed himself in any majesty in his post-chancellor career now, hanging out with Putin. And so, so I think some of it is coalitional dynamics, right? And, it is, at the same time, the Germans actually, they have given the third most amount of money, right? So we don't want to say, or the fourth most, we don't want to say they've given nothing, right? The stark reality on the military side is Germany has underinvested in its military for about 30 years. Even if they started investing right now, it's probably years before they could actually make a meaningful contribution, right? So I think a lot of it is the politics and the political willingness and some of the tortured position of where are we in this Zeitenwende. But some of it simply is the German military is tiny, right? So for me, actually, the much more glaring absence, and in some ways inexcusable absence, is France's military is very large and well developed, and you're seeing neither absolute or relative contributions, and there doesn't seem to be the domestic opposition and tension and coalitional dynamics, right? So you sort of wonder exactly what's going on in France, and I don't know French politics quite as well, but it has been striking to me that the Greens have actually been out there leading the way on this, right? It's a very big change from German politics of the 1980s to 1990s to have them and neither the CDU nor the SPD as being the ones that are leading the charge. Yeah.
What surprised me was there that big drop in 2008 in the economy, and it didn't recover.
Yes.
And I remember back in those days, General Motors dropped Pontiac, and there are different kinds of automobile things.
Yeah.
Is that part of why it didn't recover?
I mean, different people will tell you different things. I will tell you that this time around we had a $1.9 trillion stimulus that was probably bigger than the output gap, the gap between where the economy was and where it would have been in kind of potential trend line. And that caused a little bit of extra inflation, but we had a big recovery. The Obama stimulus was about $800 million, and and the output gap was 2.1 trillion, right? So, and we had the stimulus in 2009, and then by 2013 we were doing the budget sequester, and every state was cutting. You remember kind of the budget cuts here in Wisconsin and elsewhere, and so we basically did a stimulus that was a third of the size it needed to be for a third of as long as it needed to be. Right? And that's sort of the legacy of austerity, right? We haven't recovered from that. So I think a lot, for the Biden administration, it was very much, we're going to go big, because we're probably only going to get one shot at this, and also, if I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the upside and rather the downside. And again, I showed you those charts of the EU and their relatively poor recovery, that you see the same thing. Greece and Italy never recovered from the euro crisis in 2010 to 2015. They've never really recovered from COVID, and now you're kind of entering another recession from Russia, Ukraine, and sort of each time, if you don't do enough in terms of monetary and fiscal stimulus, you fall behind. It's very hard ever to make that up, because you have to overshoot in the other direction for a period of time, right? So that's the glass is half full way looking at this. Is we have gotten back to the trend line, but the trend line of 2017 was a trend line well below where the trend line was pre-2008, right? And that was a lost decade. It's probably never coming back.
Would you like to write a book entitled The Legacy of Austerity?
I have too many current and possible book projects yet to take that one on, but it's an intriguing possibility.
All right, I call dibs then. Mike.
Yeah, could I plunge in and ask a question about 2024?
You can ask. I don't know if I can give you an answer.
Okay, my greatest fear for 2024 is that unless someone gets serious and starts prosecuting Trump, what is going to happen is that we might have a rematch between Trump and Hillary again, and I think that would be a disaster for the country either way. What's your point of view about that?
I will put no bets on 2024. My expectation is that Biden is going to run again. And if for some reason Biden doesn't run again, that the VP is most likely to be the incumbent, the sort of nominee presumptive. I think at this point, who knows what's going to happen on the Republican side? It very well could be Trump. I'd be surprised if it was Hillary. No.
I'm just standing here with that breathtaking optimism, Mike, that you just showed. Other questions? If not, good.
Thank you for getting up there.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm wondering what you think drives the negative bias in media coverage on the economy. Like, do you think it's recency bias? Do you think it's incentives for horse race coverage? Do you think it's economic illiteracy or something else?
Yeah. I think it's sort of related to the question of what we don't know yet is how much of it is like Fox News and conservative media versus, so I think some of it is, Fox and Breitbart are going to focus on what's bad for the Biden administration, and that's the thing to focus on. It's a good question. I think part of it is a general, like, if it bleeds, it leads type of thing of this is sort of, this is the economic equivalent of that, right? I think part of it is, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but there, I have a model in my head where most of the people who run most of the institutions in American society now are in their 50s and 60s. And the formative economic event for them was the oil shocks, right? And so everything is viewed through the lens of our historical lessons. And, for my generation, it'll be something different than for kind of my students now. It will be living through the pandemic, et cetera. So I think there is a rush of people because we had no inflation, right? And very low gas prices for a very long time that the thing people latch on immediately is this must be like the 1970s again, right? And so I think it's a combination of those things. I think when you're talking about like, Politico and political news coverage, it's more the horse race coupled with some of the economic illiteracy. But I think the economic journalists now for the papers of record are excellent and better than, by orders of magnitude, I think, than they were, in decades past. So I think a lot of the coverage, right, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal is actually very good coverage. It just sort of is befuddling to me that there are 40 articles on inflation for every one on the recovery. So like I don't quite get that and exactly why the people who should know better are not kind of modulating the volume. But some of those might be editorial decisions and not the sort of writer decisions. But I think mostly it's there must be something wrong, and this is the thing that's wrong, and we can kind of, there's also with gas prices, it's an in-your-face thing. That's something that started in the 1970s, and it never left local media, right? You just report on gas prices, right? And you're doing it when gas prices were, 150 or 210. There was kind of no reason to be covering gas prices, and now it's sort of like 360 seems high, but again, I'm puzzled, like, there was no gas price hysteria in 2012 to 2014 when gas prices were at $3 and change. Right? So sort of something seems to be different now that this is why we're focusing on it. And, so I don't have one good answer, but kind of a set of working hypotheses about it.
Another question from back here?
Sorry, we all want to go get our drink, but we want gas prices high so more people will drive less, and we will go to public transportation, and bikes and trains, etc. So how is that message, how can that message be?
Who's we? Right?
I
So,
think any environmentalist.
so, you know, we, the American public, tend to say that when you ask people about those things, there's sort of overwhelming support for, you know, doing more about climate change, you know, alternative energy, you know, all those sorts of things. But you also, when you ask people if they're concerned about inflation, you know, the polling data indicate then that a lot of people who say they want that are also really angry and bothered by very high gas prices. Right? So I think there's in the medium term, I want those things, right? And in the short term, I don't like the fact that gas is so expensive, right? So there's a sort of, you know, there's a St. Augustine aspect about it of, you know, I would like to pay more for gas and drive less and transition to an electric vehicle, but not yet. Yeah.
All right. One more, unless somebody else wants to ask one more.
Thanks. I might be going a little far afield here. You discussed the question of the effect that sanctions are having on Russia. I was wondering, do you know very much about the case of Cuba, which also is under a fairly intense economic blockade, and how much effect is that blockade having on the Cuban economy?
I know almost nothing about that, so I would hesitate to. Hesitate to hazard a guess. I don't know. My guess is the spillovers from the Ukraine war and the oil and food prices probably are limited in their direct impact on Cuba. But I'm sorry, I don't. I don't know that I could say anything intelligent about that beyond pure speculation. Yeah.
All right, and with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.